He had carried it for 30 years. That is the first thing you need to understand about Marco Vitelli. Not what he saw, not what he knew, but the weight of it. The specific, crushing weight of a secret that a person carries so long it stops feeling like a secret and starts feeling like a part of their own body, like something they were born with. Something that cannot be removed without taking something vital along with it. Marco Vitelli was 19 years old in the autumn of 1987. He was a busboy at Salvatore's Ristorante on Elmwood Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island. A white tablecloth place, candles on every table, a piano player on Friday and Saturday nights, the kind of restaurant where people went to celebrate the things that mattered. Anniversaries, proposals, milestone birthdays, the moments people wanted wrapped in something beautiful. He had worked there for 7 months. He was saving money for community college. He was good at the job, quiet, efficient, invisible in the way good service staff learn to be. He cleared plates and refilled water glasses and moved through the room like a shadow. On the night of October 3, 1987, a couple came in for their anniversary dinner. They sat at table 9, the corner table by the window, the one with the best view of the street, the one regulars requested for special occasions. The woman wore a green dress. The man wore a dark jacket and had a small wrapped gift sitting on the table beside his bread plate. They held hands across the white tablecloth before the menus arrived. By 11 o'clock that night, they had vanished. And Marco Vitelli had seen something that he would not tell another living soul for 30 years. Stay with us, because this story, this one, changes everything you think you know about what happened to Robert and Catherine Marsh on the night of October 3, 1987. If you are new here, please subscribe before we go further. We cover one case at a time, fully and without rushing, because every name in every file deserves that. Leave your location in the comments. We read every single one. Let's go back to Providence. Let's go back to 1987. Robert James Marsh was born on February 12, 1949, in Cranston, Rhode Island. He was the son of a plumber and a bookkeeper, raised in a 3-bedroom house that was never large enough for the 6 people living in it, but was always, by every account, full of noise and warmth. Robert was the second of 4 children, the kind of boy who was funny without trying to be and stubborn without realizing it. Qualities that would define him, in different proportions, for the rest of his life. He attended the University of Rhode Island on a partial academic scholarship, studied business administration, and graduated in 1971. He spent the following decade working his way up through the management structure of a regional insurance company in Providence, arriving, by his mid-30s, at the position of regional director, a title that came with a corner office, a respectable salary, and the particular mixture of satisfaction and restlessness that tends to settle over capable people once they have achieved what they set out to achieve. He was not a complicated man, by the description of those who knew him. He was straightforward and reliable. He kept his word. He paid his bills on time and showed up when he said he would show up. His co-worker Dennis Albright, who worked alongside Robert for 11 years and was interviewed by investigators 3 times, described him simply. Robert was the kind of man you could set your watch by, in a good way. Catherine Ann Marsh, née Bowen, was born on July 29, 1952, in Warwick, Rhode Island. Where Robert was steady, Catherine was electric. She was a high school English teacher at Providence's Jefferson Academy, a position she had held for 12 years and approached with the particular ferocity of someone who believed, genuinely and without irony, that literature could save people. Her students remembered her in the specific way that students remember teachers who changed something fundamental in them, not always comfortably, not always gently, but permanently. She was the kind of person who filled rooms without trying to, not loudly. She was not loud. But there was something in her attention, when she gave it to you, that made you feel you were the most interesting person she had encountered in weeks. Her friend Patricia Wynne, who had known Catherine since college, said, being Catherine's friend meant feeling chosen. Every time. Robert and Catherine met at a mutual friend's dinner party in October 1973. They argued, at that dinner, about a book. Catherine had loved it. Robert had not read it, but had opinions about its author. And by the end of the evening, they had exchanged phone numbers. They were married in June 1975. 12 years later, on October 3, 1987, they sat down at table 9 at Salvatore's Ristorante to celebrate their anniversary. Their daughter, Emily Marsh, was 9 years old and at home with a babysitter. Their son, Daniel Marsh, was 6 and already asleep by the time his parents left the house. Neither child would see their parents again. The reservation had been made 2 weeks in advance. Robert had called Salvatore's himself, asked specifically for the corner table by the window, and mentioned to the hostess that it was their anniversary. The hostess, a woman named Gloria Ferrante, who would be interviewed by police multiple times in the following weeks, noted this in the reservation book, with a small heart drawn beside the name. Robert and Catherine arrived at 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes before their reservation. They were dressed carefully, Catherine in the green dress that her friend Patricia had helped her choose the previous Saturday, Robert in his best dark jacket with a pale blue tie that Catherine had given him for his birthday. He had the wrapped gift beside his bread plate, a first edition of a novel Catherine had mentioned once, months earlier, in a way that made clear it mattered to her. She cried a little when she opened it, small, quiet tears that she wiped away immediately and then laughed about. Robert looked pleased in the way of someone who has managed, for once, to say exactly the right thing. Their waiter that evening was a man named Frank DeLuca, a 23-year veteran of Salvatore's who had the particular grace of experienced service staff, present without intruding, attentive without hovering. Frank would later say that the Marshes were the kind of table he enjoyed working, warm with each other, appreciative of the food, clearly happy to be there. They ordered the tasting menu. They shared a bottle of Barolo. They talked continuously throughout the meal, not the performed conversation of people making an effort, but the real, easy conversation of two people who genuinely like each other after 12 years. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Frank brought dessert, tiramisu for Catherine, panna cotta for Robert, and refilled their wine glasses for the last time. At 9:47 p.m., Robert excused himself to use the restroom. He did not come back. Catherine waited 4 minutes. Then she stood, said something brief to Frank. He would later describe her expression as confused rather than alarmed, and walked in the direction of the restrooms herself. She did not come back either. At 10:05 p.m., Frank approached table 9 to check on his guests. The table was empty. The desserts were barely touched. Catherine's green wrap was still draped over the back of her chair. Robert's wallet, containing $340 in cash and all of his identification, was still in his jacket pocket, which was still hanging on the back of his chair. The wrapped book was still on the table. The bill had not been paid. Frank assumed, briefly, that something medical had occurred, that one of them had been taken ill and the other had rushed them outside for air. He checked the restrooms, both empty. He checked outside the front door. The street was quiet. He checked the small side alley that ran beside the building. Nothing. At 10:22 p.m., Frank DeLuca called the Providence Police Department. The first officers arrived at Salvatore's at 10:41 p.m. They found a restaurant in the final stages of its evening service. Most tables cleared, a few late couples finishing their wine, the kitchen winding down. They found table 9 exactly as Frank had described it. 2 barely touched desserts, 2 chairs pushed back, a green wrap, a wallet, a wrapped book. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of any physical altercation anywhere in the building or its immediate surroundings. They took statements from Frank DeLuca, from hostess Gloria Ferrante, from the piano player, a man named Arthur Keene who had been playing near the front of the restaurant all evening and had noticed nothing unusual, and from 3 other tables of guests who had been seated near table 9. None of them had seen anything. The Marsh home was visited at 11:30 p.m. The babysitter, a 16-year-old named Donna Lacey, answered the door and confirmed that Mr. and Mrs. Marsh had left at 6:55 p.m. and had not returned. Both children were asleep upstairs. Officers stayed at the house while detectives took over the investigation. The lead detective assigned to the case was Lieutenant Francis Kowalczyk, a 22-year veteran of the Providence PD with a reputation for relentlessness. She arrived at Salvatore's at midnight and spent 2 hours examining every inch of the restaurant, the alley, the surrounding block. She found one thing. In the small alley beside the restaurant, a narrow lane used for deliveries, running between Salvatore's and the dry cleaning shop next door, there were tire tracks, in a patch of soft ground near the alley's entrance. Fresh tracks, a wide wheelbase. Consistent with a large vehicle, possibly a van or truck, the tracks led into the alley and back out again. They did not continue past the alley's far end, which opened onto a side street. Someone had pulled into the alley, stopped, and left. The tracks were photographed and measured. Investigators attempted to match them to a specific vehicle type. The match was consistent with several common van models of the era, a finding too broad to be useful on its own. The investigation spread outward. Robert Marsh's professional life was examined thoroughly. As regional director of a mid-sized insurance company, he had access to sensitive financial information and had, over his career, been involved in several claims disputes that had not resolved in the claimant's favor. Investigators identified 4 individuals who had filed formal complaints against Robert's division in the preceding 3 years. All 4 were interviewed. All 4 had verifiable alibis for the evening of October 3rd. Catherine Marsh's school and personal life were examined with equal thoroughness. No disputes of significance were found. No threatening communications. No indication of anyone who wished her harm. The marriage itself was examined. Quietly, carefully, in the way investigators must examine everything when there is no obvious suspect and no crime scene. Everyone who knew Robert and Catherine said the same thing. Theirs was a genuinely good marriage. Not perfect, no marriage is, but real and solid, and built on something that had clearly survived 12 years intact. There were no affairs, no debts, no gambling, no substance issues, no secrets, as far as anyone could find. Just 2 people who had gone to dinner on their anniversary and had not come home. By December 1987, with no body, no confirmed crime scene, no suspect, and no new leads, Lieutenant Kowalczyk's active investigation had slowed to a near stop. Emily and Daniel Marsh went to live with Robert's parents, his mother, now widowed, in the same Cranston house where Robert had grown up. Emily was 9 and understood that something terrible had happened. Daniel was 6 and understood less, which was in some ways worse. The case file remained open. The answers did not come. He was 19 years old, and he was afraid. That is the most important thing to understand about why Marco Vitelli said nothing for 30 years. Not indifference, not cruelty, fear, the specific, paralyzing fear of a 19-year-old boy who witnessed something he did not understand and who made, in the days that followed, a calculation that he would spend the rest of his life paying for. On the night of October 3, 1987, Marco was working the back section of the restaurant, clearing tables, bringing bread baskets, the quiet work of a busboy on a Saturday night. His route took him past the kitchen's side exit, which opened onto a small landing before the steps down to the alley. At approximately 9:40 p.m., Marco went to the side exit to take out a bag of kitchen waste, one of his regular tasks. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the landing. The alley below was in partial shadow, lit only by the yellow glow of a single bulb above the kitchen door. A dark van was parked at the alley's entrance, its engine running, its side door open. 2 men stood near the van. A third man, larger, wearing a dark jacket, was standing slightly apart from the others, his back partially turned. Marco almost went back inside, but then he saw the woman. Catherine Marsh was being guided, not quite dragged, but not freely walking either, toward the van's open side door. She was not screaming. She was not struggling violently. She appeared, from where Marco stood 15 feet above the alley, to be in a state of profound shock, the kind of shock that empties a person of ordinary physical responses. Her green dress was visible, even in the half-light. Robert Marsh was not visible. Marco looked but could not see him. Then the large man in the dark jacket turned slightly, and Marco saw his face. He recognized it, not from somewhere distant or uncertain. He recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a face you have seen in a specific, significant context. The man in the alley was a regular at Salvatore's, a man Marco had seen dining there at least 4 or 5 times in the preceding months, always at a corner table, always with 2 or 3 other men, always paying cash. The staff knew him by the name he had given the reservation book. Marco stood on the landing for perhaps 8 seconds. Then the large man looked up. He looked directly at Marco. Marco went back inside the restaurant. He set down the bag of kitchen waste just inside the door. His hands were shaking. He went to the restroom and stood over the sink for 2 minutes, with the cold water running over his wrists. Then he went back to work. He cleared tables, he brought bread baskets, he worked the remainder of his shift. When the police arrived at 10:41 p.m. and began taking statements from staff, Marco Vitelli told them he had seen nothing unusual that evening. He was 19 years old, and the man in the alley had looked directly at him, and Marco had understood, in the wordless way that certain moments communicate themselves with perfect clarity, that what he had just witnessed was not something he was meant to survive seeing, so he said nothing, and he carried it. The weight of a secret changes over time. In the beginning, the weeks and months after October 3, 1987, Marco's silence was driven by pure fear. He knew, or believed he knew, that the man in the alley had seen his face, and that speaking would put him in immediate danger. He quit his job at Salvatore's within 2 weeks of the disappearance, telling the manager he needed to focus on his studies. He moved out of his apartment and back to his parents' house in East Providence. He waited for something to happen to him. It did not. Gradually, over months, the acute fear settled into something more chronic. A background hum, a weight he learned to carry the way you learn to carry an old injury, not without discomfort but without constant, active awareness. He finished community college. He found work as an electrician. He married a woman named Teresa in 1994. They had 2 daughters. He built a life in Providence that was, by every external measure, ordinary and decent. He did not forget. He watched the Marsh case in the newspapers. He watched as the investigation went cold, as the years accumulated, as Emily and Daniel Marsh grew up in their grandparents' house without answers. He watched as Lieutenant Kowalczyk, in a 1995 interview in the Providence Journal, said that the case remained the one that haunted her most. He read every word. He thought about calling. Many times, he picked up the phone and put it down again. The fear, after so many years, had been joined by something else. The awareness of what his silence had already cost. The understanding that coming forward now would not only expose him to whatever danger he had feared in 1987, but would also require him to explain to the world, and to himself, why he had waited 30 years. He told himself it was still too dangerous. He told himself he didn't know enough. He told himself the man in the alley might be dead by now, or imprisoned for something else, or beyond the reach of anything Marco could offer. He told himself many things. In 2009, Robert Marsh's mother, the woman who had raised Emily and Daniel in her Cranston home, died at the age of 81. The obituary ran in the Providence Journal. It mentioned, at the end, that she was survived by her grandchildren, Emily and Daniel, and that she had never stopped hoping for answers about her son Robert and his wife Catherine. Marco read that obituary at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while his daughters were getting ready for school. He sat at that table for a long time after his daughters left. He did not make the call, but something shifted. Something that had been building for 22 years reached a point of pressure it had not reached before. It took him 8 more years. Marco Vitelli was 49 years old when he walked into the Providence Police Department on the morning of January 11, 2017. He had not called ahead. He had not consulted a lawyer, though he would later wish he had. He had simply woken up that morning, told Teresa he had something he needed to do, and driven to the station on Fountain Street. He asked to speak to whoever was currently assigned to the Marsh case. The desk officer looked at him for a moment. "The Marsh case," she repeated. "Robert and Catherine Marsh," Marco said. "They went missing in 1987. I have information." He was taken to a small interview room. He waited 20 minutes. Then a detective named Sergeant Raymond Chu, who handled cold cases for the department, came in with a legal pad and a recorder and sat down across from Marco. Marco told him everything. He started at the beginning, the evening of October 3rd. the kitchen waste bag, the side door, the landing. He described the alley and the van, and the two men and the woman in the green dress being guided toward the vehicle. He described the large man who had looked up at him. Then he told Sergeant Chu the name he had seen in Salvatore's reservation book, the name the large man had used when he dined there. Chu wrote it down. His expression did not change. He asked Marco to describe the man physically: height, build, approximate age in 1987, any distinguishing features. Marco described him. Chu asked Marco why he had waited 30 years. Marco looked at the table. Then he looked at Chu directly. "Because I was 19, he said, "and I was afraid. And then I was ashamed of being afraid. And then I didn't know how to explain the shame. And then I read about Robert Marsh's mother dying without knowing what happened to her son, and I thought—" He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I thought I couldn't be the reason another person dies without knowing." Chu nodded. He did not offer absolution, and he did not offer condemnation. He asked Marco to wait while he made a phone call. Marco waited 45 minutes. When Chu came back, he was accompanied by two other detectives. They asked Marco to go through everything again, from the beginning, in complete detail. Marco did. The name Marco Vitelli provided to investigators in January 2017 belonged to a man named Vincent Caruso, no relation to the barber in our previous story, a Providence businessman who had, in 1987, been peripherally connected to organized crime networks operating out of New England. Caruso was now 71 years old. He had served a federal prison sentence in the 1990s on racketeering charges unrelated to the Marsh disappearance. He had been released in 2001 and had, as far as law enforcement knew, lived quietly in retirement in a suburb of Providence ever since. He was alive, he was findable. The investigation that followed moved carefully. Investigators did not want to approach Caruso directly until they had corroborated Marco's account as fully as possible. 30 years had passed. Physical evidence from the scene had long been processed and archived. The tire tracks in the alley existed only in photographs. The restaurant itself had closed in 2003, and the building had since been converted to offices. But Marco's account was specific and internally consistent. He described the alley layout accurately, matching the original police photographs from 1987. He described Catherine's green dress, a detail that had appeared in the original missing persons report but had never been widely publicized. He described the van as dark blue or dark green, consistent with a vehicle type common in the late 1980s. Most significantly, he described a second man in the alley whose face he had seen partially. Working with a forensic artist, Marco produced a composite image of this second man. The composite was run against law enforcement databases and against the original investigation's list of known associates of Vincent Caruso. It matched a man named Tommy Renata, a low-level associate with a criminal record who had died in 2004. This was significant. It placed two men from Caruso's circle at the alley behind Salvatore's on the night the Marshes vanished. Investigators applied for and received a warrant to access historical phone records, financial transactions, and property records associated with Vincent Caruso and his known associates from the period 1985 to 1990. What they found required 3 weeks to fully analyze. Robert Marsh had been, for 12 years, the regional director of Providence Mutual Insurance. What investigators discovered in the archived financial records was that in 1986 and 1987, Robert's division had processed a series of large commercial claims, fire damage to several warehouse properties, that had been approved for payout despite what an internal compliance review had flagged as irregularities in the supporting documentation. Robert had approved those claims. What the 2017 investigation established, through financial forensics, archived correspondence, and the cooperation of a former Providence Mutual employee who had been trying to report his concerns since 1992, was that the warehouse fires had been deliberately set and that the insurance claims were fraudulent, and that Robert Marsh had not been a willing participant in the scheme. He had been presented with falsified documentation that appeared legitimate. When he realized, in the summer of 1987, that something was wrong, That the claims he had approved were fraudulent and that the fires had been arson, he had made contact with a state insurance fraud investigator. That contact, investigators believed, had been observed. Robert Marsh had not been targeted because he was corrupt. He had been targeted because he was about to expose corruption. He had gone to dinner on his wedding anniversary with a referral meeting scheduled with a federal investigator for the following Monday morning. He never made it to Monday. Vincent Caruso was arrested at his home in North Providence on the morning of April 3, 2017. Exactly 29 years and 6 months after the night Robert and Catherine Marsh vanished from Table 9 at Salvatore's Ristorante. He was 71 years old. He answered the door in a bathrobe. He said nothing when the officers identified themselves and read his rights. He was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of conspiracy, and, in a development that came from evidence gathered in the weeks between Marco's statement and the arrest, accessory to murder. Because Robert and Catherine Marsh had not simply vanished. The evidence assembled by investigators, phone records, financial transactions, the testimony of a second witness who came forward after Caruso's arrest became public, established what had happened after the alley. Robert Marsh had been separated from Catherine in the alley. He had attempted to resist and had been injured in the altercation. He had died, the evidence indicated, within hours of the abduction, at a location investigators would spend the following year trying to identify precisely. Catherine Marsh had been kept alive longer. Where, and under what circumstances, and what ultimately happened to her? These questions the investigation could not answer with the same certainty. The second witness, an elderly man who had been a peripheral figure in Caruso's operations in the late 1980s, provided information that was specific enough to be credible, but incomplete in ways that the passage of 30 years makes inevitable. What could be established? Neither Robert nor Catherine Marsh were alive. They had been killed because Robert was about to speak to a federal investigator. Catherine had been killed because she was with him. They had gone to dinner on their anniversary. They had held hands across a white tablecloth. Robert had given Catherine a first edition of a book she had mentioned once. She had cried a little and wiped the tears away quickly and laughed about it. And then they were gone. Emily Marsh was 39 years old when Sergeant Raymond Chu called her on the evening of January 11, 2017, the same day Marco Vitelli walked into the Providence Police Department. She was a pediatric nurse in Boston. She had built a life that was full and genuinely good. A husband, 2 children, work she believed in. She had, like Nora Mitchell in our previous story, arrived at a kind of peace with the not knowing, not acceptance of the loss. You do not accept the loss of both parents at age 9. But a working relationship with uncertainty, a way of carrying it that did not prevent living. The call from Sergeant Chu did not give her answers, not yet. It told her only that a witness had come forward and that the investigation was being reopened. She sat in her kitchen after the call and looked out the window for a long time. Then she called Daniel. Daniel Marsh was 36 years old, living in Providence, had always lived in Providence, had never been able to bring himself to leave the city where his parents had last been seen. He worked as a high school history teacher. He had never married. His colleagues described him as thoughtful and slightly melancholy, in a way that seemed constitutional rather than circumstantial. The way some people are built, they said, not understanding that his particular melancholy had a very specific origin. When Emily called and told him what Chu had said, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do they know what happened to them?" Emily said, "Not yet." Daniel said, "Okay." That was all he said. One word. But Emily knew her brother, and she knew that the word contained 30 years of waiting compressed into a single syllable. Over the following months, as the investigation progressed and information was shared with the family through a victim's advocate, Emily and Daniel learned the truth in pieces. The insurance fraud scheme, Robert's contact with the investigator, the alley, Caruso. They learned that their parents had gone to dinner on their anniversary and had been targeted because their father was trying to do the right thing. Emily said, in a brief statement she gave to the Providence Journal after Caruso's arrest, "My father was going to report fraud. He was killed for it. I want people to understand that." He wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was exactly where a good man would be. Daniel did not give any statement. He attended the preliminary hearing. He sat in the courtroom and looked at Vincent Caruso for the first time. He later told Emily that Caruso had not looked at him once during the entire hearing. The question of Marco Vitelli is the most complicated part of this story. He came forward. That is not nothing. 30 years is a long time, and the reasons he waited, fear, shame, the paralysis of having waited too long, are human reasons. They are not good reasons. But they are comprehensible ones. Emily Marsh was asked, in an interview, whether she blamed Marco for his silence. She thought about the question for a long time before answering. Then she said, "I blame the people who made a 19-year-old feel like speaking the truth might get him killed. I blame the system that made that fear reasonable. Do I wish he had called someone in 1987? Yes. Every single day of my life I wish that. Would it have saved my parents? Possibly. Possibly not. We will never know." She paused. "What I know is that he came forward eventually, and that because he did, we know the truth. We know what happened to my mother and father. We know they didn't leave us. They were taken from us. And there is, I know this sounds strange, there is comfort in that. In knowing that what I always felt was true, turned out to be true. They loved us. They loved each other. They were happy that night. Someone ended that happiness, but they were happy." Marco Vitelli was not charged with any crime. Failing to report a witnessed event is not, in most jurisdictions, a criminal offense, and prosecutors determined that his voluntary testimony was more valuable than any symbolic charge would have been. He gave his full testimony at Vincent Caruso's trial in February 2018. He sat in the witness box and described, in precise detail, what he had seen in the alley behind Salvatore's on the night of October 3, 1987. He described the green dress. He described the van. He described the man who had looked up at him. He looked at Emily and Daniel Marsh in the gallery once, briefly, before he began his testimony. He did not look at them again. He looked straight ahead and told the truth, the whole truth, 30 years late, because it was the only thing he still had to give. Vincent Caruso was convicted on 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of conspiracy on March 14, 2018. He was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison, a sentence that, given his age of 72 at sentencing, amounted effectively to a life sentence. He maintained throughout his trial that he had no knowledge of what had happened to Robert and Catherine Marsh. His defense argued that Marco Vitelli's 30-year silence undermined the reliability of his testimony. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The remains of Robert and Catherine Marsh were never recovered. This is the part of the story that does not resolve, the part that Emily and Daniel carry alongside everything else. There is no grave. There is no place to go and stand, and feel the ground beneath your feet, and know that the people you are thinking of are nearby. There is only the knowledge of what happened, and the verdict, and the table at Salvatore's that no longer exists. Emily keeps a photograph from her parents' anniversary dinner that year, taken a few weeks before October 3rd, at a family gathering, both of them dressed nicely, laughing at something outside the frame. She keeps it on the mantelpiece in her Boston home, where her own children can see it. She has told her children about their grandparents, about Robert's steadiness and Catherine's electricity and the way they held hands across white tablecloths, about the first edition book and the small, quiet tears. She has told them that their grandfather was trying to do the right thing, and that it cost him everything, and that the doing the right thing part is the part that matters most. There are 2 stories inside the story of Robert and Catherine Marsh. The first is the story of a couple who went to dinner on their anniversary and were killed because a good man was about to do a courageous thing. It is a story about what happens to people who see corruption and decide, against their own safety, to report it. It is a story about the real and terrible cost of moral courage in environments where power protects itself violently. The second story is about silence. Marco Vitelli was 19 years old, and he saw something he should not have seen, and he made the choice that fear makes for young people when they have no support, no guidance, and no framework for what to do with an impossible thing they have witnessed. His silence did not cause the deaths of Robert and Catherine Marsh. Their deaths had already been decided by the time Marco stepped onto that landing. But his silence meant that the people responsible faced no consequences for 30 years. It meant that Emily and Daniel Marsh spent 30 years without knowing. It meant that Robert Marsh's mother died at 81 without the truth. Silence, in the face of witnessed wrongdoing, is never neutral. It always has a cost. Sometimes that cost is paid by the person keeping the silence. Sometimes, more often, it is paid by someone else entirely. This is not a condemnation of Marco Vitelli. It is an observation about what fear does to people, and what happens in the space between what we witness and what we choose to say. That space is where justice lives or dies. That space is where cases go cold. That space is where families spend decades waiting. If you have ever known something that someone else needs to know, something about a disappearance, a crime, a wrongdoing, please understand that the cost of silence does not disappear simply because you carry it alone. It accumulates, it compounds, and eventually, it falls on you, or on the people who deserved the truth from the beginning. Marco Vitelli found his way to the truth eventually. 30 years late. It was not enough to save Robert and Catherine Marsh. It was enough to give their children answers. It was enough to put the man responsible in a prison cell. Sometimes that is the best that truth can do. It is still worth telling. Robert and Catherine Marsh sat at table 9 on the night of October 3, 1987, and held hands across a white tablecloth and opened a book and cried small, quiet tears and were happy. That happiness was real. It existed. No one can take it back. Not Vincent Caruso, not 30 years of silence, not the absence of a grave or a marker or a place to stand and remember. It happened. They were there. They loved each other. They loved Emily and Daniel. They were a family sitting down to dinner on their anniversary, and they were exactly where they wanted to be. Remember that. When you think of them, remember that part first. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. It is a heavy one. We know that. But these names deserve to be spoken, and these stories deserve to be told fully, with all their weight intact. If this case moved you, please press the like button. It helps us reach more people who might need to hear these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. We are here every week. Leave a comment. Tell us what part stayed with you. And please, if you know something, tell someone. It is never too late. It is always worth it. We will see you in the next case file.